The scorching sun hung high in the cloudless sky as Calvin trudged through the endless desert. His water canteen was nearly empty, and each step felt heavier than the last. His vehicle had broken down miles back, leaving him stranded in this unforgiving wilderness. The vast expanse of sand and rocks seemed devoid of life, except for the occasional whistling of the dry wind. As he wiped the sweat from his brow, something caught his eye. A figure in the distance. At first, he thought it might be a mirage, a cruel trick played by the heat. But as he squinted, the figure became clearer. It was a person, or at least it looked like one, walking alone across the dunes. Curiosity sparked in Calvin's tired mind. What kind of person would be out here, miles from civilization? With no better options and a gnawing need for human contact, he decided to approach. As he drew closer, the figure came into focus. It was a woman wrapped in a tattered, hooded cloak that fluttered in the wind. Her movements were slow, almost cautious, as if each step was a calculated effort. Calvin noticed something odd. Her skin seemed to shimmer faintly, almost glowing under the harsh sunlight. "Hey," he called out, raising a hand in greeting. His voice cracked, dry from thirst. The woman froze, turning her head sharply toward him. Her face, partially hidden beneath the hood, revealed almond-shaped eyes that glowed faintly silver. Calvin stopped in his tracks, his heart racing. She wasn't human. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with caution. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she clutched a small bag close to her chest, her fingers tightening around it as if protecting something precious. After a moment, she spoke, her voice soft and melodic, but tinged with exhaustion. "I need water." Calvin hesitated. He didn't have much water left himself, but something about her desperate tone made him act. He pulled out his canteen and offered it to her. She eyed it warily, then reached out with slender, glowing fingers and took a sip. Her movements were careful, as if she feared wasting a single drop. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. She handed the canteen back, her silver eyes locking with his for a brief moment. "What are you doing out here?" Calvin asked, his curiosity growing. "This desert isn't exactly friendly." She glanced around nervously, as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. "I'm searching," she replied cryptically. Her grip on the bag tightened, and Calvin couldn't help but notice a faint hum emanating from it, like the low buzz of electricity. Before he could ask more, the woman straightened, her posture tense. "We shouldn't stay here," she said abruptly. "They're coming." "Who's coming?" Calvin asked, his pulse quickening. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she began walking briskly toward the horizon, leaving Calvin with a choice: follow her into the unknown or face the desert alone. Calvin hesitated for only a moment before jogging to catch up with the mysterious woman. The desert's emptiness suddenly felt much more dangerous, and he wasn't keen on facing whatever she feared by himself. Her footsteps were quick but light, leaving barely a trace in the sand, while he struggled to keep pace. "What do you mean, they're coming?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. The woman glanced back, her silver eyes glinting in the sunlight. "Bounty hunters," she said simply. Her voice was calm, but her grip on the small bag tightened even more. "Bounty hunters," Calvin repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity. "What are they hunting?" "You?" She didn't answer right away, instead scanning the horizon as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. Finally, she said, "They want what's in this bag, and they'll do anything to get it." Calvin's eyes dropped to the bag she clutched so protectively. It was small, worn, and seemed unremarkable, but now he noticed the faint hum it gave off. It wasn't natural. "What's in there?" he asked cautiously. The woman stopped suddenly and turned to face him. "Something that can't fall into the wrong hands," she said, her tone firm. "You shouldn't ask too many questions, human. It's safer for you that way." Calvin raised an eyebrow. "Safer?" Lady, I'm already walking through a desert with no supplies, and now I'm apparently being chased by bounty hunters because of you. I don't think I'm winning any safety awards right now." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Was it guilt? She sighed and adjusted the bag on her shoulder. "I didn't ask for your help," she said, though her voice was softer now. "But you gave it anyway. For that, I owe you a debt." Calvin shook his head. "I didn't do it for a debt. I just couldn't leave you out here alone. But I'd like to know what I've gotten myself into." She didn't respond, instead turning to continue walking. Frustrated but unwilling to abandon her, Calvin followed. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon when they spotted a cluster of rocks that offered some shelter. They settled there, the shade providing brief relief from the heat. Calvin sat down with a heavy sigh, pulling his shirt collar to fan himself. The woman, meanwhile, remained alert, scanning the horizon. "What's your name, anyway?" he asked, trying to break the silence. "Elira," she said after a pause. "And you?" "Calvin," he replied, leaning back against the rock. "Nice to meet you, Elira, even if the circumstances aren't exactly ideal." Elira allowed a faint smile, though it disappeared as quickly as it came. "We can rest for a little while, but we can't stay long. They'll track us by nightfall." Calvin nodded, though unease settled in his chest. Whoever they were, he had a feeling this was only the beginning of the trouble, and whatever Elira was carrying, it was more dangerous than she let on. The sky had turned deep orange, the setting sun painting the desert in warm hues. Calvin sat by the rock, trying to conserve energy, while Elira stood a few steps away, her eyes scanning the horizon. She hadn't relaxed for a single moment, her sharp gaze darting from one direction to another. "What exactly are we waiting for?" Calvin asked, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "Confirmation," Elira replied, her tone tense. "They're close. I can feel it." "Feel it?" Calvin tilted his head, confused. "What does that even mean?" Elira didn't answer immediately. Instead, she crouched down and placed her hand on the ground, her eyes narrowing. "The sand vibrates. Their engines leave faint traces." Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled slightly. Calvin blinked. "Engines. So, they've got vehicles." He let out a sharp exhale, feeling the weight of the situation sink in. "Great. We're on foot, and they've got vehicles. This just keeps getting better." Elira stood up quickly, her movements fluid and precise. "We need to move. Now." Before Calvin could ask why, he heard it, a faint, low rumble in the distance. It was subtle but unmistakable. The sound of machines cutting through the desert air. His stomach tightened as he realized she was right. Someone was coming. Without hesitation, Elira grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. "This way," she urged, leading him toward a cluster of dunes. Calvin stumbled but managed to keep up, adrenaline now coursing through his veins. "What's the plan?" he asked, struggling to keep his breath steady as they sprinted across the uneven terrain. Elira glanced back briefly, her hood falling slightly to reveal more of her glowing features. "We stay out of sight. If they see us, they'll use force. They won't care who gets hurt." "Fantastic," Calvin muttered, his heart pounding in his chest. "Any chance you've got a weapon in that magic bag of yours?" "No weapons," Elira replied firmly. "Just what's needed to survive. Violence only attracts more violence." "That's comforting," Calvin said, though his sarcasm was lost in the urgency of the moment. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by faint beams of light piercing the darkening desert. Calvin glanced over his shoulder and spotted them. 3 sleek, black vehicles with bright searchlights sweeping the sand. "They're sweeping for us," he whispered harshly, panic rising in his voice. Elira pulled him down behind a large dune, her finger to her lips. "Stay quiet," she whispered. "Let them pass." The vehicles drew closer, their lights dancing over the dunes like restless ghosts. Calvin held his breath, every muscle in his body tense. The hum from the bag in Alira's grasp grew slightly louder, and he noticed her clutching it tighter than ever. "Do they know where we are?" he mouthed silently. Alira shook her head but looked unsure. The searchlights lingered dangerously close to their hiding spot, the tension unbearable. Calvin's heart raced as he prepared for the worst. Would they be discovered, or had they evaded their pursuers this time? The vehicles moved closer, their engines humming louder as the desert sand trembled under their weight. Calvin and Alira crouched behind the dune, barely daring to breathe. The searchlights swept over their hiding spot, illuminating the fine grains of sand before moving on. Calvin's heart pounded in his chest, the sound almost deafening in his ears. For what felt like an eternity, the lights danced across the dunes, scanning every crevice and shadow. Finally, the vehicles veered off, heading toward the far horizon. The sound of their engines gradually faded into the distance. Calvin exhaled, his breath shaky with relief. "That was too close," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Alira nodded but didn't relax. Her silver eyes remained fixed on the direction the vehicles had gone. "They're not gone. They'll circle back." Calvin sat back, running a hand through his messy hair. "Of course they will. Why wouldn't they?" He paused, glancing at the bag she clutched so tightly. "All right, Alira. No more vague answers. I need to know what's going on. What's in that bag, and why are these people so desperate to find it?" She hesitated, her grip tightening on the bag. For a moment, Calvin thought she would deflect his question again, but then her shoulders sagged, and she sighed. "You're right. You deserve to know." Carefully, Alira unwrapped the bag, revealing a small metallic orb about the size of a grapefruit. It pulsed with a soft, blue glow, faintly illuminating her delicate, glowing hands. The hum Calvin had heard earlier was now more pronounced, almost melodic. What is that?" Calvin asked, leaning closer but resisting the urge to touch it. "This is an ancient artifact," Alira said softly. "It's called the Loomis Core. My people created it long ago, a device capable of incredible power. It was designed to restore dying ecosystems, to heal planets that had been ravaged by war or neglect." Calvin blinked, his mind struggling to comprehend the significance of what she just said. "Heal planets. You're saying that thing can fix entire worlds?" She nodded. "Yes, but in the wrong hands, it could do the opposite. It can be turned into a weapon, one powerful enough to destroy civilizations." Calvin's jaw tightened as he stared at the glowing orb. "So these bounty hunters, they want to use it as a weapon?" Alira's expression darkened. "Yes. They work for a syndicate that profits from chaos and destruction. If they get the Loomis Core, they'll sell it to the highest bidder, someone who will use it to dominate or destroy." Calvin leaned back, the weight of her words sinking in. "And you? What were you planning to do with it?" "I'm trying to return it to a safe place," she said, "somewhere it can't be weaponized." Calvin met her gaze, his voice firm despite the fear bubbling inside him. "All right. If this thing is as important as you say, then we need to make sure it doesn't fall into the wrong hands." For the first time, Alira smiled faintly. "Thank you, Calvin. I didn't expect a human to be this understanding." Calvin smirked. "Yeah, well, maybe humans are full of surprises." The moment of calm didn't last long, though. Alira's ears twitched, and she looked back toward the horizon. "They're coming again," she said, her voice tense. "We need to move now." The desert stretched endlessly before them as Alira and Calvin moved quickly, leaving their hiding spot behind. The faint hum of the Loomis Core echoed softly in the air, but Calvin could only focus on the distant roar of engines growing louder. The bounty hunters were relentless. "How far is this safe place you're trying to get to?" Calvin asked, his breathing heavy from the effort of trudging through the soft sand. "It's far," Alira admitted, her voice calm but laced with urgency. "But there's an outpost a few miles ahead. If we can reach it, we might find supplies and shelter. Calvin glanced behind them. The searchlights had reappeared, sweeping the horizon like hungry predators. They're gaining on us. What happens if they catch us? They won't catch us, Alara replied firmly. But if they do, they'll kill you and take the core. No one can be left alive if they think you've seen this. Well, that's comforting, Calvin muttered, quickening his pace. You know, I didn't exactly sign up for a suicide mission. You didn't have to stay, Alara said, glancing at him with a faint smile. But you did. He rolled his eyes but couldn't deny it. Something about her determination and the importance of the Loomis core compelled him to keep going. Despite the danger, he couldn't abandon her. As they crested another dune, the terrain ahead changed. The sand gave way to jagged rocks and scattered boulders, offering better cover but more difficult footing. Alara led the way, moving with an agility that Calvin could only envy. This way, she said, motioning toward a narrow canyon up ahead. We can lose them in there. Calvin followed, stumbling over the uneven ground. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, providing a reprieve from the searchlights, but the sound of the engines was louder now. The bounty hunters were closing in. Do you have any tricks up your sleeve? Calvin asked, glancing nervously at Alara. She nodded and placed the bag with the Loomis core down for a moment. Pulling a small device from her cloak, she pressed a button, and a faint shimmer spread across the canyon entrance behind them. It was almost invisible, like a heatwave in the air. What is that? Calvin asked, amazed. A decoy field, Alara explained. It will confuse their scanners for a little while, make them think we've gone another way. That's incredible, Calvin said, watching as the shimmer blended seamlessly into the surroundings. Why didn't you use this before? It only works in narrow spaces, she replied, picking up the bag. And it doesn't last long. Let's go. They continued deeper into the canyon, the walls narrowing around them. Calvin couldn't help but marvel at Alara's calmness under pressure. She moved with purpose, her focus unwavering, even as the hum of the engines faded and then returned, louder than ever. Do you think it worked? Calvin asked, his voice hushed. I hope so, Alara said, but we can't stop moving. The engines roared overhead, and Calvin's heart pounded. If the decoy failed, they would have nowhere to run. The canyon walls pressed in on either side, casting long shadows over the path ahead. Calvin and Alara moved quickly, the crunch of their footsteps on the loose gravel the only sound between them. The decoy field had worked, for now. The searchlights had passed over their location, but Calvin knew it wouldn't be long before the bounty hunters realized they'd been fooled. We can't stop here, Alara said, her voice low but urgent. We need to find shelter, somewhere the scanners can't reach us. Calvin nodded, feeling the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. I'm starting to think we're not going to outrun them forever. If we don't find a way out of this, we're done for. Alara didn't respond right away, her eyes scanning the narrowing canyon. You're right. But if we get to the old outpost ahead, we might find a way to contact someone for help. It's our only chance. Calvin wasn't so sure, but he didn't argue. Lead the way. They continued deeper into the canyon, their pace quickening as the sun dipped lower behind the mountains. The air was dry and cold now, the desert night quickly replacing the brutal heat of the day. Calvin shivered, his skin still coated with sweat from the earlier heat. As they rounded a corner, they saw the faint outline of a building up ahead, a weathered, half-destroyed structure that barely resembled a settlement. It looked like an old research station, long abandoned. That's it, Alara said, her voice filled with relief. We can rest there. If we're lucky, we might find something useful. Calvin followed her toward the building, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape behind them. The searchlights were gone, but he didn't trust that the bounty hunters had given up. They had been chasing Alara for too long to just stop now. As they reached the door of the outpost, Alara hesitated. Stay close, she whispered, pushing the door open slowly. The hinges creaked as they entered, the interior dark and dusty. The building had clearly been abandoned for years, its walls covered in a thin layer of grime and sand. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of decay. Calvin's eyes adjusted to the dim light as he followed Alara through the corridors. The walls were lined with old equipment, most of it broken or rusted beyond use. "There has to be something here," Alara muttered, moving to a nearby console. She began fiddling with the controls, her fingers swift and practiced. "I just need to access the network." Calvin glanced nervously over his shoulder, his senses heightened. "You think this place still has a working network? Seems like it's been abandoned for ages." Alara didn't answer, her focus entirely on the console in front of her. The soft beeping of the device filled the room as the screen flickered to life. "I just need to contact someone. Anyone." As she worked, Calvin's mind raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The tension in the air was thick, and even in this abandoned place, it didn't feel safe. Suddenly, the distant sound of engines reached his ears again. Calvin's heart skipped a beat. "They're back," he whispered urgently. Alara froze, her fingers stilling over the controls. "They found us," she said quietly, a note of fear in her voice for the first time. Calvin turned toward the door, his thoughts racing. They couldn't stay here, but they couldn't outrun the bounty hunters either. A decision had to be made, and quickly. The sound of engines grew louder, closer, filling the silence of the abandoned outpost. Calvin's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to Alara, who was still working at the console. She seemed calm, but her eyes were wide, the silver glow flickering with anxiety. "We don't have much time," Calvin said, his voice tight with urgency. "We can't stay here. They'll be here any minute." Alara didn't respond immediately. She continued tapping at the controls, her fingers moving with precision, but the nervous tension in her posture was clear. Finally, she stepped back from the console and looked at him. "You're right," she said softly, her voice steady but with an edge of worry. "They'll be here soon." Calvin took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "So, what now? What's our plan? You said we had to contact someone. Did you manage to get through?" She shook her head. "Not yet. The system is outdated, and I don't have much time to figure it out before they find us." She glanced at the small bag holding the Loomis core, her face tightening as she seemed to consider something. "What's in that bag?" Calvin asked, his curiosity growing again. "You've been so secretive about it, and I think I've earned the right to know. What's so important that people are willing to hunt you down for it?" Alara hesitated for a moment, her eyes flickering to the door, then back to him. Her shoulders slumped as she finally spoke. "It's not just technology," she said, her voice soft but heavy with emotion. "The Loomis core is alive, or at least part of it is." Calvin blinked, confused. "Alive? What do you mean?" "It's just a device, right? A machine." "It's not just a machine," she corrected gently. "It's a bioengineered artifact. It was created by my people, the Valorians, to help restore worlds that have been ravaged by war, like mine was. The core holds the DNA of an entire ecosystem, a blueprint for life itself. It's not just a tool. It's a living part of the Valorian legacy." Calvin's mind raced as he tried to process the information. "So this thing, it's not just dangerous in the wrong hands because of its power, but because it can create life." "Yes," Alara said, her voice almost a whisper. "It can rebuild worlds, terraform entire planets, bring back extinct species. But it's also fragile. If it's misused, if someone tries to control it, it can implode. It could destroy everything. That's why the Syndicate wants it. They want to use it as a weapon to conquer and destroy, not heal." Calvin felt a cold shiver run down his spine. This wasn't just about stealing technology. It was about the power to reshape entire planets. The implications were beyond anything he could imagine. "So you're carrying the future of your people in that bag?" he asked, his voice low. Alara nodded slowly. It's not just my people's future. It's the future of countless worlds. I was supposed to take it back to the Valorian Council for safekeeping. But her voice trailed off, her expression distant, as though haunted by a memory. What happened? Calvin asked, stepping closer. The Syndicate, Alira said, her jaw tightening. They ambushed me. I barely escaped with my life. Now I have to get this back to my people before they realize I'm alive. If they don't, the universe is in danger. Calvin absorbed her words, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. It wasn't just her life at risk anymore. It was the fate of entire worlds. The Loomis Core had the potential to save or destroy everything. We need to protect it, Calvin said, his voice firm. No matter what. Alira's silver eyes softened, a faint glimmer of gratitude in them. I didn't think a human would understand. He gave a small smile. Maybe humans aren't as predictable as you think. But their moment of quiet resolve was interrupted by the sound of engines again, closer now, and unmistakably coming their way. We don't have much time, Alira said, her voice tense. We have to move, now. The rumble of the engines grew louder, unmistakably approaching. Calvin's heart raced as he and Alira scrambled to their feet. The small outpost, with its crumbling walls and outdated technology, felt like a trap now. The bounty hunters were closing in, and there was nowhere to run. Alira didn't hesitate. She grabbed the bag containing the Loomis Core, clutching it to her chest with a fierce determination. We need to move, she said urgently, her voice sharp with panic. Calvin nodded, his mind racing. They couldn't stay here. The outpost was no longer a safe haven. They needed to leave. Now. They ran toward the back of the building, where a narrow passage led into the desert. The sound of engines was growing louder, and Calvin could almost feel the heat of the searchlights that would soon be on them. Alira was a few steps ahead, moving with an urgency that Calvin couldn't quite match. Her determination was clear, but he knew they had to think strategically. Where are we going? Calvin asked between breaths, trying to keep up. There's a cave system not far from here, Alira answered quickly. It's well hidden. We can lose them there. They dashed toward the opening in the canyon, the sounds of the engines still echoing behind them. Calvin glanced back, trying to spot the vehicles, but the shadows of the desert made it difficult to see anything clearly. Every second felt like an eternity. As they neared the cave entrance, Calvin could see the flickering headlights of the bounty hunters' vehicles illuminating the distant dunes. They were close. Too close. We won't make it, Calvin muttered, his chest tightening with fear. Alira's eyes flickered with something like resolve, and she turned to him. We don't have a choice. We'll have to make them think we're going in a different direction. Before Calvin could ask how, Alira pulled something from her cloak, an old, worn-looking device. She held it up and pressed a button. For a moment, there was nothing, but then a soft pulse of light shot out, creating a shimmering illusion across the canyon walls. What did you just do? Calvin asked, his eyes wide with surprise. I activated a decoy field, Alira explained quickly. It will confuse their scanners and make them think we went the other way. Calvin's mind was still trying to catch up, but he didn't question her. He trusted her, even if it seemed like an impossible plan. Let's hope it works, he said, taking a deep breath. They continued running, now relying on the cover of the decoy to mask their movements. The bounty hunters' vehicles rumbled past the entrance to the cave, their searchlights sweeping the area. But they never slowed down. It was working. Alira and Calvin finally reached the cave, breathing heavily but relieved. The walls of the cave were cool and dark, offering them the shelter they desperately needed. Alira placed the Loomis Core gently on the ground and looked at Calvin, her silver eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. We did it, she said softly. Calvin nodded, still trying to catch his breath. For now. They sat in the cool darkness, the silence around them a welcome change from the chaos of the chase. Alira's shoulders slumped, and she seemed to let out a breath she had been holding for too long. "I can't thank you enough," she said, her voice quiet. "You risked your life to help me." Calvin looked at her and smiled. "It's not about thanking me. I couldn't just leave you out there." Alara studied him for a long moment, and then she reached into her cloak and pulled out a small object, a shard of something metallic, glowing faintly. "This is a piece of the Loomis Core's energy field," she said. "I'm giving it to you. It's a symbol of trust." Calvin stared at the glowing shard in her hand. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Alara replied, her voice firm yet gentle. "Just know that you've helped protect something far more important than either of us." The hum of the Loomis Core continued to echo in the air, a reminder of the powerful force they had kept safe. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, Calvin felt a flicker of hope. They had made it through another round, but he knew their fight wasn't over. They had to stay one step ahead of the bounty hunters, and the journey ahead was still uncertain. But for now, in the cool darkness of the cave, they had a moment of peace. The cave was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy and oppressive. Calvin leaned against the cool stone wall, trying to catch his breath. Alara sat across from him, her eyes fixed on the glowing shard of the Loomis Core she had given him. The faint hum of energy filled the air, a constant reminder of the weight they carried. "We're not safe yet," Calvin said after a long pause, his voice hoarse. "They'll come looking for us again." Alara nodded, her silver eyes dark with concern. "I know. They won't stop. Not until they have the Loomis Core." They both fell into a quiet, tense stillness, the sound of distant wind drifting through the cave. Calvin kept his gaze on Alara, wondering what was going through her mind. Despite her calm exterior, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the toll the chase had taken on her. "So what's the next move?" he asked, breaking the silence. Alara hesitated, her fingers running lightly over the bag that still contained the core. She didn't meet his gaze immediately, as though weighing her words carefully. "I need to contact my people," she said softly. "The Valorian Council. Only they can help me protect the core from falling into the wrong hands. But the system is old, and I don't know how long we can hide here before the bounty hunters find us." Calvin felt a knot form in his stomach. Alara's desperation was palpable. She had been running for so long, and now it seemed like the end was near. He didn't want to think about the possibility that they might not make it. He had promised to help her, and he wasn't about to back out now. "I'll help you," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Alara met his gaze, her silver eyes softening slightly. "I didn't expect you to stay this long," she said quietly. "I thought you'd leave once you realized how dangerous this was." Calvin shook his head. "I'm not the kind of guy who walks away when someone needs help, and right now, you need all the help you can get." Alara gave a faint smile, though it was tinged with sadness. "You're more than I expected." The sound of engines broke the moment of calm. It was distant at first, but it quickly grew louder. Calvin's heart skipped a beat, and Alara stiffened, her eyes widening in alarm. "They've found us," she whispered. Calvin's mind raced. He didn't know how much time they had before the bounty hunters would reach the cave. They couldn't outrun them this time. They had to fight, or they'd be captured. Alara jumped to her feet, her eyes scanning the cave's narrow entrance. "We need to move. Now." Calvin followed her instinctively, his thoughts clouded with urgency. The cave wasn't large, and there were few places to hide. The bounty hunters would have no trouble finding them if they stayed here too long. "Where are we going?" Calvin asked, trying to keep up with her. "There's a pass through the cliffs," Alara said. "It's dangerous, but it'll take us to a hidden settlement. If we can make it there, we might have a chance to get off-world." Calvin nodded, his pulse quickening. He had no idea what kind of hidden settlement Alara was talking about, but at this point, he trusted her completely. He'd seen her skills, and he knew she had a plan. They ran through the dark, winding tunnels of the cave, the sound of the approaching vehicles growing louder with each passing second. The pressure was mounting, and the weight of the situation pressed down on Calvin's shoulders. Suddenly, Alyra stopped. Calvin almost collided with her, but she held up her hand, signaling him to be silent. She listened carefully, her expression focused. "They're close," she whispered. "We'll have to move fast." Calvin nodded, adrenaline rushing through him. There was no time to waste. The bounty hunters were close, too close. They had to escape before it was too late. Alyra motioned for him to follow, and together they moved deeper into the cave, hearts pounding in sync, knowing that the next few moments would determine everything. The deep, echoing rumble of the approaching vehicles grew louder with every passing second. Calvin and Alyra had no more time to waste. The moment of silence they had shared in the cave was shattered by the unmistakable sound of engines and the crackle of distant voices. The bounty hunters were closing in. "Move." Alyra's voice was sharp, urgent. She grabbed Calvin's arm, pulling him toward a narrow passage in the rocks that he hadn't noticed before. They had no choice but to trust it. There was no going back now. Calvin followed her, his breath coming in short bursts. The path ahead was winding and tight, the jagged rocks scraping his skin as they pushed through. The sound of the bounty hunters' vehicles was now right outside the cave. Calvin could hear their engines rev, their wheels digging into the sand as they searched for any sign of movement. "Keep going," Alyra urged, her voice steady despite the tension. "We're almost there." They reached a dead end, but Alyra didn't hesitate. She pressed her hand against the rock face, and a hidden door slid open with a faint hiss. The passage beyond was dark, but Alyra seemed to know exactly where she was going. They moved quickly, the only sound the rush of their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. "What is this place?" Calvin asked, trying to catch his breath. "A safe haven," Alyra replied without slowing. "A place where my people can protect the Loomis core. If we can get there, we'll be safe." Calvin didn't have time to ask more questions. They had reached a large underground chamber, its walls lined with strange symbols and glowing panels. Alyra quickly moved to one of the panels and began typing in a series of commands. The lights flickered as the screen came to life, revealing a map of the surrounding area. "This is it," Alyra said, her voice filled with a mix of relief and determination. "We're not far from the settlement." Calvin glanced around. The room felt ancient, yet there was an energy to it, an energy that made him feel like they had stumbled onto something much bigger than they had first imagined. The Loomis core pulsed softly at Alyra's side, a constant reminder of the power they held in their hands. As Alyra continued to input commands, Calvin heard a noise, soft at first, then growing louder. It was the sound of footsteps, of voices. "They're here," Calvin whispered, his heart racing. Alyra didn't look up, her fingers moving rapidly across the controls. "I know. We can't let them get to us. Not now." Calvin felt a wave of panic rise in his chest. He didn't know how much longer they could keep running, how much longer they could keep hiding. But Alyra's calm presence steadied him. She had a plan. She had always had a plan. Finally, the screen beeped, and a hidden door slid open. Alyra stood up, motioning for Calvin to follow. They moved quickly into the narrow passage beyond. "Are we safe?" Calvin asked, trying to keep up. "For now," Alyra said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But we're not out of the woods yet." They moved through the passage, the walls seeming to close in around them. Calvin could feel the weight of their journey pressing down on them. Every step they took felt like it was leading them closer to an unknown future. But one thing was clear: no matter what happened next, they had come this far together. As they emerged into the open air, the night sky stretched out before them, vast and endless. The stars shone bright, like distant beacons of hope in the dark. Alyra stopped for a moment, looking up at the stars. "I didn't think we'd make it this far." Calvin looked at her, his heart heavy with everything they had been through. "We're not done yet, but we're closer than we were before." Together, they stepped forward into the unknown, knowing the path ahead would be dangerous, but determined to face it with the strength they had found in each other. The Loomis Corps might have been their burden to bear, but it was also their hope for the future, for the universe, and for their survival.